let's talk about two or three other things that were there at the start that contributed to that evolution too. One, of course, was the fact that we had used the nuclear weapon in essentially the way that we were doing strategic bombing. We used it against military-industrial targets in large urban complexes. We had just a few nuclear weapons at the time. In an oral history interview conducted years after the war, General George Marshall told his biographer when asked the question, what would you have done if they hadn't surrendered after Nagasaki? He said, we of course would have gone ahead with the invasion, but he also said that, you know, our plan was to use the next 2 to 3 nuclear weapons that we had as battlefield weapons. We were going to drop them ahead of the invading forces that would go ashore. And we knew that the invading forces would then have to go through radiation fields, but we had calculated that the casualties would be fewer doing that than they would have been if you hadn't had that kind of a shock effect. Mm-hmm. If the United States had first of all used, or not first of all, but had used nuclear weapons in both the what we later came to call strategic and the battlefield mode at the start, that would have been one of the factors that might have changed how we thought about things. Now, a second factor was just the conventional forces. Well, we had built up the largest military that the world had ever seen during World War II, a tremendous mobilization. But there was great demand as soon as the war was over to bring the boys home. And President Truman and his senior advisors simply weren't able to stand against that political pressure, even if they had not wanted to. Mm-hmm. And the way that they did that was basically a first in, first out. So you would have a lot of units that on paper had their equipment, but they were totally hollow units because they had lost their aircraft mechanics and all of that kind of thing. And President Truman also was grappling with the question of how do we keep the United States from sliding back into depression after the war. We had, you know, the conversion was taking jobs away. You had the military coming home. You had all those kinds of problems. And so he was in the mode of trying to hold down costs and balancing the budget for a period of time. That didn't end really until the Korean War. So you had that factor. But the third factor was we now had commitments to allies that were different than we had before. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed. And the United States brought with it to the North Atlantic Treaty nuclear weapons. You know, Jim Schlesinger has made the point, the late Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Energy, Jim Schlesinger, made the point in a book he wrote once that the United States may not have had the confidence to do all the kinds of things it did, include in the commitments it made to NATO in the late 1940s if it didn't have the nuclear weapon. But at any rate, in 1949, NATO is created. In 1950, after the Korean War breaks out, President Truman calls General Eisenhower out of retirement, and he goes over to begin putting together an integrated military structure for NATO. In 1955, West Germany regains its independence, and 4 days later joins NATO, which is something that would have been difficult to conceive had the United States not been in there. Incidentally, within a week after that, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact. And so we had all these allies in Europe that relied on American deterrence. We, of course, tried to rehabilitate the European economy through the Marshall Plan and things of that sort. But you still didn't have a lot of incentive to build up large conventional forces. Yeah. So you had that dynamic that was going on early on as well.
Well, I think that it's easy to spring forward into a full-fledged understanding of the value of NATO and what NATO is today, but we went through another period of fairly significant isolationist attitudes in this country after World War II. That, you know, as usual, there was a concept that this is the last major war. We now know how to prevent war, and that we had the experience following World War I. We also had a particularly wise set of leaders available to us coming out of World War II, including General Eisenhower, whose perhaps his greatest strength was not military genius. It was just pure diplomatic international leadership. That was his mindset. That's the way he thought. But so going into NATO or going into the alliance, I think it was inevitable that we would try once again. If you really, though, were going to look at what made that successful, well, I would have to thank Joseph Stalin. Because clearly, while there was a lot of sentiment for more international cooperation and trying to find new avenues to not only settle disputes, but just to reduce tensions, but this existential threat from the Soviet Union, backed by the largest ground army the world has ever seen, and arguably the most effective land army the world has ever seen. And that's not to take away from the Allied armies, but if you look at what the Red Army faced, and what the Red Army went through compared to everything else, there's a reason they call it the Great Patriotic War. So there was at least very solid agreement as to what we faced. The U.S. was a bit of a reluctant leader, that it was inevitable that we would take a leadership position, but we weren't all that thrilled about it, because we still had a lot of what I will call isolationist motivation in this country. You know, you mentioned the concern with sliding back into the Depression. That was a very real issue. That having lived through the Depression in my youth, and having seen us rise out of that Depression, which was very, very personal to people who lived where I lived, in the middle of the Dust Bowl, where there were very few jobs. So from 1940 to 1942, the whole economy was transformed, and where I lived. Of course, it was also helped by the fact that it started raining. And so the combination of the rains came. But by the late 40s, there was sort of a standard joke that how do you tell that a wheat farmer's had a bad year? The answer is because he's washing his own Cadillac. So that it was just completely, it was a transformation of life for people who had lived in the middle of the Dust Bowl through the Depression. And there was significant awareness that certainly the rains helped, particularly with the dust, but that it really was a wartime buildup that created that. I think what we missed was that the wartime buildup was not just to provide, it wasn't just adjusting to the need to have a war machine. The wartime buildup transformed industry. It transformed what people thought they wanted. It transformed the consumer industry. You may remember from 1942 to 1945, there were no new automobiles. That 100% of the production went into building Jeeps and tanks, et cetera. So I think some of the economists missed this huge built-up latent desire by the consumer. So we came out of that war with a much healthier economy because of it, but we also came out of it with a very different consumer attitude. Now, I'm telling you that because I reflect my family and the community in which I lived. And just as a grade school or high school kid, it was very obvious to me what was happening to the American way of life. That the difference between, in my life, the difference between 1942, when I was 8 years old, and 1948, when I was 14 years old, it was a completely new world. It was a completely new way of life. So I think that's why we didn't see any tendency to slip back into the years of the Depression. I don't know that we'd gotten any better at managing the economy, but we certainly had a different consumer class. Let me say just a bit more about the NATO issue, and that there were always stresses and strains within NATO. But we went from being sort of the reluctant leader, and the Marshall Plan had an enormous impact on Europe's attitude towards our leadership. Well, we went from there to a gradual set of distrust, in that fear that we would look after our own interests to their detriment. I happened to be in the last combat unit stationed in France. And I guess President de Gaulle, I would call him, made the decision that he didn't want American combat forces on French soil. And of course, this was a result of the Cuban crisis and the Berlin crisis, where he saw that U.S. leadership might lead him into a war that he didn't want, or lead him into a war that wasn't to France's benefit. I think we had difficulty grasping the difference in attitudes among some of our European allies, or I should say not European governments, but European populations. I rented a house when I was stationed at Chaumont in the early 60s. I rented a house from a French business person. And he was very anti-de Gaulle. He was a communist. But I had to pay my rent in person because he wanted to talk to me. And at one point in time, he was complaining about the Americans being there. And I told him I'm a young captain, of course, so I know everything. And I said to him, hasn't it ever occurred to you that if we weren't here, that you might again be occupied by a foreign power? And he said, to my astonishment, yes, it's occurred to me, but what you don't know is I've been through 2 occupations and I'm just fine. And he had been occupied twice and he was just fine. I reminded him that, well, but the last time you were occupied, you had other powers that could come to your rescue. Great Britain the first time, the United States the second time. If you were occupied by the power that I'm worried about, you would have no great power to come to your rescue. And he said, oh, then it would still be all right. I said, we just absolutely, as a young captain, I absolutely could not understand such an attitude. I had since discovered there are differences. Anyway.
Well, no, the national and strategic culture does make a big difference.
Yes, a huge difference.